Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about social cognition. Let's get started. So, this is our first learning outcome. Please take a few seconds to read it. First, let's try to understand what is social cognition. To understand it, let's separate the social part and the cognition part of this definition. So, what is cognition? Cognition is about how we encode, store, and use our mental representations. One way to look at it is to imagine our mind as a computer, right? So in order for the computer to process information, it has to read the information, store it somewhere, and use it. So cognition is about our mind doing the same thing, right? Encoding information, storing it somewhere, and then use these informations. And the form of the information that is storing in our head is called mental representations by psychologists. And the study of cognition stem from the traditions of cognitive psychology. Social cognition is just a smaller subset of cognition, right? So it's human cognition that is about other people's, whether it is about learning about other people, understanding other people, or predicting other people's thoughts, emotions, or behaviors. Social cognition is also about how our thoughts, our cognition is influenced by others, people, right? Whether it is our beliefs, attitudes, or goals. So researchers who study cognition or social cognition want to, want to understand the structure of the mind, the structure of our cognition. What is it like? And researchers tend to agree that the mind is like an associative network. And a good analogy for the structure of the mind is a mind map. Right? You might have done this once or more times in your life. And basically, the mind map consists of information like concepts, examples, etc. And these informations or concepts are connected to one another or are associated with one another. Right? Similarly, the mind has all these mental representations, such as memories, whether it's a memory, an episodic memory, which is your memory about like a particular memory about a time in your life, um, about what you eat for dinner last night. It can also be cemented memory, more general memory about um, things like math, like what is 1 plus 1 equal 2. So those are cemented memory. Um, these mental representations can also be attitudes, beliefs, right? Goal, motivations, expectation about something, behavioral script, which is um, a script for how a person might act in a particular situations. So all these mental representations are connected to or associated with other mental representations. For example, if you think about Chapel Hill, which is a mental representations in your mind, a real location, but it is it is manifested in your mind as the mental representation. Right? Your thoughts might go to UNC from Chapel Hill because UNC is in Chapel Hill. And when you think about UNC, um, your mind might go to other things like the memories of your friends at UNC, your goal and motivations for your classes this semester, or how you feel about UNC. So all these mental representations are connected to UNC and might be activated because you think about UNC. So when we refer to a group or a category of interconnected knowledge, which include the mental representations and their associations, their connections. We call this a schema. So a schema is simply a category or a unit of knowledge that include all the connected representations and their associations. For example, you might have a schema about UNC Chapel Hill that involves all these mental representations that is associated with UNC, like your friends, like your class, how you feel about UNC, or the location, which is Chapel Hill. So how does these mental representations get activated? How do you use it? According to schematic theory, mental representations are activated through what's called spreading activation. Right? So it's akin to a water stream flowing or an electric current flowing from one place to another. For example, you might think about college, right? And because college is associated with UNC, right? Because you go to UNC, your mind might go to UNC, and then the next thing you think about might be your friend or your class at UNC. You might have heard of free association technique. It's a technique in psychoanalysis where a person would start on a topic. Right? Would think about a topic and then freely say whatever comes to their mind next without trying to filter their thought, without trying to inhibit anything. And in combination with hypnosis, free association is believed by Freud, none other than Freud, that free association would grant you access to your unconscious thoughts or your repressed memories. I'm not so sure about how effective it is, but the exercise of free associations does illustrate the spreading activation of your mental representation. Here's our second learning outcomes. I'll give you a few seconds to read it. All right. So as we talk about schema, right? Schemas are cognitive structure. So it sounds like schemas are static. They don't change because they're structural. But the opposite is true. Schemas are dynamic. Right? We update our schema all the time as we incorporate new informations, as we grow older, as we go through different de developmental stages and have different experiences, we would change schema. For example, think about your movie theater schema when you were a child. What are the mental constructs that are associated with that? Maybe you have specific memories about going to the movie theaters with your parents, specific, memories about your favorite movies to watch at the theater as a kid. How might your movie theater schema change when you were in teenage year, right? So your schema might be updated with memories about um, going to the movies with your friends instead, or with your dates. Right? Some people start to think about movie theater as a kind of experience during dating. So how is your schema about movie theater now? In the time of COVID, movie theater might be viewed as obsolete, right? Maybe thinking about movie theater make you feel unsafe because of the pandemic, or maybe when you so our schemas do change. In what situation would it change? It's when we encounter novel informations, or we encounter a stimuli, um, some stimuli that would defy our expectations, goes against what we expect. Right? And we would typically have two possible reactions. One is we would try to change the stimulus, change our perceptions of the stimulus, change our interpretation of the informations so that it fits our existing schema. This is called assimilation. We are assimilating some information into our existing schema without fundamentally changing our schema. The other response is where we change our schema, change the structure of our cognition to fit the new information in. Right? This is called accommodation. So accommodation is how learning occurs, since you have to change the structure of your mind to accommodate or to make room for new informations. And by changing your schemas, you're learning new informations, you're learning new ways to look at the world. Take an example, wearing mask. Right? At the beginning of the pandemic, it appears that mask wearing wasn't important. Even the CDC say so. So the CDC advised people not to wear masks at the beginning. So you might have a schema that mask wearing is not effective against COVID-19. However, as time goes on, the mask recommendation changes. Right? So now the CDC tell you to wear mask. When facing this new information, you might have two responses. One might be, well, there might be new evidence about mask effectiveness that makes the CDC update their recommendations. The other response might be, well, I still don't think masks change anything. Masks wouldn't protect anyone, and the CDC is either clueless or fake news. Right? So, which one of these respond is assimilation, and which one is accommodation? So, if you think that the first one is accommodation and the second one is assimilation, you're correct. Why is the first response accommodation? It's because we're updating our schema or our beliefs based on new information coming in. The second example is assimilations because we simply change our perceptions of the new informations, right? Or change our interpretation of the new informations so that it fit our existing belief. We don't really change our existing beliefs. So learning is equal accommodations. Learning is about changing your schemas. Let's go a little bit deeper into how we learn and change our schema. How do we accommodate new information? So there are three possible ways. One is through associational learning, also known as classical conditioning. So you might have learned this in depth in Insight 101. I'm just going to provide you a quick review. You might be reminded that classical conditioning is discovered by Pavlov. So the basic idea of associational learning or classical conditioning is that you pair two stimuli together. A new stimulus that you want the learner to remember or respond to in a particular way, and an old stimulus with an already formed or established response. A real life example of this is in commercial. For example, in beer commercials, what you can check out the YouTube clips by clicking on the image in the PowerPoint slides. In beer commercial, the producer of Corona want people to remember the beer, right, and to think about their beer in a positive way. So the producers would pair the beer with something sexy and something funny, which people would respond positively to. A second way to accommodate new informations is through operant learning. And operant learning research is pioneered by Thorndike and Skinner. So the gist of operant learning is that consequences inform behavior. When animal or when human perform a behavior and there's a reward, we would encode the positive feelings and the memories of positive consequence for that particular behavior in our schema, so that you would more likely to perform the same behavior again in the future. The opposite is also true for punishment, right? Being punished leads people to decrease a particular behavior. A third way that you might accommodate new information is through observational learning. You see this a lot in children, or actually in human of all age, but particularly children. Through observational learning, we just learn by simply observing what other people do. We don't need associations, or we don't need to see a particular consequence. On the slides, there are links to these commercial and video clips of Albert Bandura about observational learning that you can watch. So make sure you watch it. Now that we talk about learning and changing our schema, here's essay option number 1. If you choose to do these options, please respond to both prompt 1 and 2. Feel free to pause the video to read the prompts, and then we'll move on. So this is our learning outcome number 3. Please take a couple of seconds to read them. So not all mental construct, not all mental representations are created equal, right? So let's talk about this idea of schema accessibility. It basically means that some mental representations are easier and faster for us to activate or to access than other representations, other mental construct. Consider this metaphor. Think of the mind as like a fish tank. So a fish is like an individual mental construct. A school of fish is like a schema that have associated and connected mental constructs, right? So the fish that is closer to the surface is easier for us to catch. So similarly, highly accessible construct or mental representations are easier for us to access, easier for us to think about, to remember. And the fish that is close to the bottom is harder to catch, right? And similarly, there are less accessible representations that are harder to activate. So think about your last restaurant that you had dinner. Not too hard. You can also think about the first restaurant that you eat at in Chapel Hill. For me, it's still very vivid memory of that restaurant. Now think about the third to last restaurant that you eat at. It's a lot harder, right? At least for me. I don't even remember what is the third to last restaurant that I eat at. So the first two are examples of highly accessible mental constructs. And the third example is an example of a less accessible mental construct. So on the sides, this is called, there's a thing called the order effect. Right? So the first thing and the last thing in a list is easier to remember than things that are in the middle. It's the same for experiences. You can probably remember like when's your first time or last time doing something, but it's a lot harder to remember something in the middle. Now I want you guys to quickly respond to this prompt. What immediately comes to your mind when you think about an animal that begins with the letter E? So if you think elephant or said elephant is probably the most common response to this question. So in this case, elephant is the most accessible mental representation that you retrieve for this particular prompt. Why is elephant so easily, remembered by us? It's possibly cultural, right? Elephant, maybe we get a lot of exposure to elephant in pop culture. So an elephant is an animal that commonly show on TV or like products, even though we don't often see them in real life. Um, there are also two elephants on the beginning slide that are not so obvious, but you might have seen it or registered it at the beginning slide of this presentation. So the elephants were put there to make the mental representation of elephant more accessible for you. And that's what psychologists call priming. And there are a lot of interesting research on priming, how priming would change our decision making or would activate unconscious goal to help people pursue their goal more effectively. What is the consequence of highly accessible mental construct? The consequences are that these constructs are easier and faster to activate than less accessible construct. Another important consequences of accessible construct is that it has important behavioral impact. When we're in a situation that we need to decide how to act, all things being equal, our action is probably more affected by more accessible mental representations in our mind. There might be certain behavior script that is easier to remember to us than others, so we might go with those first compared to behavior scripts or factors that affect our behavior that are harder to access. However, we don't always use highly accessible mental construct to inform our decision, judgment, or behavior. There are situational factors that might increase or decrease the likelihood of using accessible mental construct. For example, imagine that you're answering a question in an important exam. You might have, like a highly accessible idea about what the correct answer might be. That might just like pop up immediately for you when you see the questions. But because the exam is so important, you don't want to get it wrong. So you might spend additional time to dig deep and think carefully about other alternatives. In contrast, if the test is not so important to you and you just want to get it over with, you might just go really quickly with the first answer that seems right. So in this case, situational importance would impact whether you want to use highly accessible mental construct or not. So situational factors matter. There's this funny situation on Family Feud. So for those who don't know, this is a game show where the contestants have to provide answers within a pretty tight time limit. And this contestant give a really funny answer that probably reflect a highly accessible mental construct that she has. So what I want you guys to do is to watch the video and identify the situational forces that cause this contestant to say penis on national television. Once you guys come up with several answers, come back to this video and we'll discuss your answers. So in this situation, there's several factors that might be at play that influence whether she would use a highly accessible construct or highly accessible ideas to respond to the questions. So the first one, the first factor is time pressure. She's under immense time pressure. And research has shown that when people are under time pressure, they're more likely to rely on highly accessible mental representation to make the decision or judgment. Another factors that we have discussed is situational importance. So in more important situation, people tend to dig deeper and not rely as much on accessible mental construct. However, this factor might have been sort of overshadowed by the time pressure, and also because this is so important, people might experience more stress and anxiety. And when people are under stress or anxiety, they are also more likely to rely on accessible mental construct to inform their decision, to inform their judgment. Another situational factors that might make a person, actually this is more like a dispositional factor that make a person more likely to rely on accessible construct in a situation. And this disposition is need for closure. And what it means is that people with higher need for cognitive closure, they want quick and firm answers. They like certainty. They don't tolerate ambiguity. So think about people who can tolerate ambiguity and have less of a need for like a quick answer. They would more likely be able to spend more time on finding the answer, trying to find the. So here's your essay option number 2. If you choose to complete this option, please respond to your own prompts. Feel free to pause the video and read the prompts before we move on.